Hi, everybody. So, we all know the Bible has contradictions, right? And not just alleged contradictions or supposed contradictions, as apologists like to call them, but actual straight up says two things that both can't be true at the same time contradictions. And today I want to talk about the difference between these two things. Dig a little deeper into what we mean when we say the Bible contradicts itself, and then look at some examples of how apologists try to wriggle out of the problem. To do this, we're going to look at the Gospels' accounts of Jesus' empty tomb. The Gospels tell four very different stories about this event, and they're different in many varied ways. So not only are the Gospels a good case study in contradictions, but the way apologists respond are also a good case study in how Christians try to say that, those contradictions aren't contradictions. So we're going to get into some clips that I think are pretty representative of how apologists handle this. But before we do that, I want to briefly overview this topic, including what some of the main contradictions are. If you're at all familiar with this topic, you've probably seen a chart like this one, right? We have which women were at the tomb, which varies in each story, with Mary Magdalene depicted going with a different number of women or by herself, and then a lot of general details like whether guards were posted at the tomb, when the women went, why they were there, whether the stone was rolled away when they showed up, and whether they went inside. Of course, who greeted them at the tomb was also a big one, with each story depicting a different number of angels or men at the tomb. Then the stories are all over the place on the topic of whether the disciples were told and if and when they went to the tomb themselves. Now, there's a mistake we as skeptics can make when approaching these, and that's to just look at a chart like this, maybe check the Gospels to see if the contradictions are there, and then take each one as flatly contradicting the stories. But you can't just walk up to an apologist and be like, well, did you know that Matthew shows 2 women going to the tomb, Mark shows 3, Luke shows who knows how many, and John shows Mary Magdalene going all by herself? And think these kinds of straightforward facts will work as some kind of gotcha. The apologist will have a straightforward answer for that in like 5 seconds. Now, this doesn't mean that you're wrong and there's no contradictions there. It also doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with this chart. It's good for kind of just indexing everything and helping you know where to go to find certain kinds of contradictions. So there's nothing wrong with using this to orient yourself in the story and just get your bearings and find out, where the main ideas are to dig into. But you can't stop there, or you can't use this as like a primary checklist of contradictions. To really get a sense of what's wrong with a story, or maybe what's not, and to what extent, you actually need to read through them. If you don't do that, you're operating at a very surface level with these, and you're kind of setting yourself up for apologist excuses to work on you, or at least throw you for a little bit of loop. Now, this doesn't mean that you're operating on a more superficial level than the apologists are. I would say it's more that you're operating on the same superficial level that they are. And this gets to the core of one of the main things apologists do. They don't really dig into the real serious contradictions in the story. They also certainly don't dig into what the most intelligent reading of the story is, or what you would take from each one at face value. What they like to do is operate on the level of what is exactly on these charts. So they take small semantic things that are easy to debunk in isolation, like how many women were at the tomb. They like to take that, pull it out by itself, and deal with that out of the context of the story, and just pretend they debunked it. If you just use your chart, you're not going to be prepared for that, and you're going to set them up to succeed. You're basically playing their game. So if you were to just show an apologist this chart and say, well, how many women were at the tomb, or how many angels were at the tomb? Not doing yourself any favors, because they're just looking for some semantic way out. And so the better way is just to dive a little deeper into the story. And that's what I want to do today. I also, of course, like I said, want to look at how some apologists handle this. And I'm going to bring up some clips as examples. Now, there's one thing that's inevitably going to happen, which is that Christians are going to say, I'm going after low-hanging fruit. Whoever I came up with isn't a good example of the best answers. But I scoured this quite a bit, and I think I came up with what are some pretty good exemplars for how apologists handle this. And they do include some mainstream apologetics communicators. We have Inspiring Philosophy, which I know a lot of you will groan about that, but I'm not just picking up low-hanging nobodies. He is a pretty good voice for articulating what some of the main apologetics are, for better or for worse. I'm also going to include the illustrious William Lane Craig. So I think it's a little baseless to say that I'm just going after low-hanging fruit. I really wanted the best example so I could tackle this head on. And these guys sum up some of the main ideas that I think are out there. Of course, there's also the go read a book thing. That's a whole other story. I might put an explanation for that on screen, or if not, I'll put it in the description, but I don't want to stop and talk about that here. But in the end, if you think this isn't being treated fairly, don't just sit there and say, hey, you didn't tackle the best idea. This is a straw man, since you probably don't know what a straw man is. Put a better explanation in the comments. Don't just tell me there's something better out there and I'm, going after the worst version. Anyway, let's get down to business. We're first going to look at some clips by Inspiring Philosophy. His first one is going to be tackling the question of which women and how many were at the tomb.
Supposed Bible contradiction. How many women went to the tomb? One of the most popular alleged contradictions is to point out each gospel says a different number of women went to the tomb on Sunday morning.
I find it interesting that Christians like to call this one of the most popular alleged contradictions because I just don't hear skeptics bringing it up that often. Like, maybe they do, but I don't hear it that much. And I've been around the block in the skeptical community. I even posted some questions on my community page and on Twitter asking people for their favorite contradictions. I didn't put it in context, so I wasn't trying to set them up to deny this. I just asked, what are your most interesting or favorite Bible contradictions? And not a single person brought this up. It was arguably mentioned in general lists of how the gospel stories of the resurrection contradict themselves, but nobody specifically said how many women at the tomb. So I find it a little iffy that Christians so often say that this is what atheists like to bring up all the time, because I tried to elicit it from atheists and couldn't even get it then. So, maybe Christians just aren't that in touch with what the skeptics are saying about the Bible. Maybe I just haven't been hearing this as often as it's being said. Or maybe apologists just like to throw this softball in the air and knock it out of the park and act like they just hit a home run on atheists. Who knows? Maybe some combination of all three.
Matthew says Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Mark says Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Luke says it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and additional women. And John only mentions Mary Magdalene. So all agree Mary Magdalene was there, but Matthew adds another Mary. Mark and Luke say this was Mary the mother of James, and Mark adds someone else named Salome, and Luke adds Joanna. So skeptics assert the Gospels are inconsistent and cannot give us a clear picture of who was at the tomb on Sunday morning. However, in reality, skeptics are overplaying their hand.
I mean, I guess, maybe. Again, I don't know how many skeptics are going around saying that this and this alone is a slam dunk against the Bible. But if those people are out there, then sure, they're overplaying their hand. Because, say it along with me, because I think we all know where this is going, each of the Gospels doesn't say that the women it lists are the only ones that went to the tomb. So, go for it, Inspiring Philosophy. Teach a good solid lesson to whoever out there thinks that this debunks the Bible.
The issue can be sorted out by noting the ancient literary practice of spotlighting. First, it should be obvious, no gospel says only the women I have listed went to the tomb. Since they do not say this, the gospels do not necessarily contradict.
Oh shoot, what'd I miss? Oh, it was just it wasn't only those women thing that we were waiting for? Okay, cool.
Second, take the Gospel of John. It is true he says Mary went to the tomb, but in the very next verse, he reports that Mary said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." It is unlikely she is referring to herself as a royal plural, and more likely implies there were other women with her. So in reality, both John and Luke are open to there being additional women with Mary.
I guess maybe the we might mean there were more women with her. I don't know. But it's not like the only other option is that she was using the royal we. She was there with two disciples, so maybe the we meant that the three of them together didn't know where the body was. Maybe she was referring to the Christian movement in general. Maybe John is just inconsistent here. Maybe it's an internal inconsistency. Maybe John is drawing on different traditions, and it kind of clumsily placed a we from one tradition next to a story of Mary going by herself. Who knows? There are all kinds of possibilities. Now, I'm not saying these are all the most likely options. Some of them admittedly do sound a little far-fetched. Like somebody going up to two other people, telling them that they can't find a body, and then including those people in the we? That does sound a little bit weird. But you know what else sounds weird? Telling a story where you only mention one person going to do something, and then having them use a we to refer to people that you hadn't included in the story before. That's also kind of strange. This gets to a core thing about how apologists handle this stuff. They will bend over backward to come up with any justification, no matter how far-fetched, that harmonizes the gospel accounts. But then as soon as there's a competing explanation that challenges those harmonizations, then suddenly they develop a really discerning palette for what is plausible and implausible sounding.
The reason as to why John doesn't mention them has to do with the ancient literary practice called spotlighting. The scholar Mike Licona defines spotlighting as when an author focuses attention on a person so that the person's involvement in a scene is clearly described, whereas mention of others who were likewise involved is neglected.
Yeah, so I think it's pretty clear what spotlighting is and why inspiring philosophy brings it up. I mean, it does sound a little bit like something Mike Licona made up and that isn't commonly used in literary or textual analysis, simply for the fact that when I went to try to Google it, I simply could not find it used in that way, connected with all kinds of terms related to ancient texts or literature. It only came up when I connected it to the name Mike Licona, so take what you want from that. Also, forgot to mention that when Mike Licona brings this up, it's in an article explaining Bible contradictions. So, But I am planning on granting a lot of things for the sake of discussion today, so fine. Different stories emphasize different people. So if all the Gospels told about different lists of women going to the tomb, then maybe a big old mess of women went, and different Gospels only mention different ones. That's why I just really don't find this a very interesting contradiction. It's easily overcome with semantics. Now, yes, if you just sit down and read each individual gospel as a story, it definitely sounds like they're saying different things. Matthew and Mark specifically name 2 and 3 women respectively, Luke depicts an open-ended crowd of women, and John just tells us the tale of one woman going to the tomb by herself. Just sit and read these without an agenda and you will picture different things in your head. A plain reading will suggest that they are depicting different events. However, I have to acknowledge that I'm not stepping into a normal, intelligent conversation about these texts. I'm not talking to people, say, in a university classroom who really want to get to the bottom of what each one is trying to depict and what literary history produced it. I'm in a conversation with people who are dead set on reconciling these stories as accurate and consistent depictions of reality, no matter what that takes. So I have to prepare for that conversation instead, unfortunately. Now, a depiction of the women at the tomb would be very relevant for the first conversation, but it's comparatively useless for the second because, like we've already covered, an apologist could just say, well, they just didn't mention those specific women. So I'm just going to set this one aside and say, fine, this by itself is not a contradiction. From here, inspiring philosophy is going to talk about how spotlighting was used in other ancient texts and speculate on why the different gospels might have wanted to spotlight different women. It's all clearly just post hoc rationalization, but it does give him a semantic way out, so we're just going to let that go. From here, let's move on to a video where he talks about angels at the tomb, because that's where this can really start to get interesting.
Supposed Bible contradiction. How many angels or men were at the tomb? Skeptics will note there are inconsistencies with what happened on Sunday morning when Jesus rose from the dead. Specifically, with regards to who was at the tomb to announce that Jesus had risen.
Sure, but I do think it's worth pointing out that who was at the tomb is a far less interesting question than where were they and when and how did the women discover them. One is a relatively easy soft pitch question when asked out of any other context. The other two can be a bit more difficult.
Mark says it was a man, Matthew says it was an angel, Luke says there were 2 men, and John says there were 2 angels. Now, despite this appearing as an inconsistency on the surface, if we study the details more, we will find this hardly qualifies as a contradiction. First, the fact that Matthew and Mark only mention one being there instead of two doesn't mean there is a contradiction. In the ancient world, authors often employed a literary device called spotlighting.
Yeah, spotlighting again, blah, blah. We don't really need this explained again, so we're going to skip the next minute and 15 seconds or so where he defines it and gives examples.
So Matthew and Mark are probably just spotlighting the angel that spoke and didn't find it necessary in their ancient cultural context to mention there was another one with him. There is no rule that the gospel authors had to mention literally everyone involved in every incident they report. Matthew and Mark probably only felt it necessary to mention the angel that spoke to get the story across.
Yeah, I guess. This has the same problem as the women who went to the tomb. On one hand, there's the plain reading of the text, but on the other, an apologist can always say, nah, you can't prove that all the stories were about two angels and some of them only mentioned one. So, cool, that's fine. But I do think this is a little especially unusual when you're talking about somebody relaying a story about seeing something paranormal. Like, if I were standing out in my yard and a spaceship came down and 5 aliens came out and one of them said, we're here to visit Earth, take us to your leader or something like that. I probably would not run around telling people, hey, I saw one alien and it said it came to visit Earth. In a situation like that, I'd probably be very in tune with the details, very fascinated by all of them and wanting to pass them all along. So while somebody saying an angel was there and said, do not fear, Jesus is risen or whatever, not a contradiction, but it kind of shows you how far they're reaching just for a semantic excuse, right?
With regards to 2 gospel authors saying they were men and the other 2 saying they were angels, this is hardly an issue. Luke, for example, does refer to them as men, but later in the very same chapter, he also says they were angels. Mark describes the man as in a white robe delivering divine revelation. Throughout the New Testament and in other Jewish works, angelic and divine beings are often described as being in white and appearing at random to deliver divine revelation. They can also be described as appearing as men. So it is hardly a problem to suggest Mark is claiming an angel spoke to the women who appeared as a man in a white robe. Both Matthew and John also describe the angels as being dressed in white.
Yeah, I would actually wholeheartedly agree with this one. Even as an atheist, if I read about women going to the tomb and seeing a man who was dressed in white and made proclamations about Jesus, I would pretty much assume they were talking about an angel. So, I guess this might be someone's idea of a contradiction, but I don't really care about it, and we're still very much at the surface level of easy contradictions.
Skeptics also allege that Matthew contradicts the other Gospels in where one of the angels was sitting. The other 3 suggest the angels were inside the tomb, but Matthew 28:2 says one angel sat on a stone outside of the tomb. However, Matthew might also imply the angel moved and that time had passed from when the stone had rolled away to when the women arrived.
Okay, so here we finally start approaching some of the actual problematic stuff, which is where the angels were when the women spoke to them. According to inspiring philosophy, the problem is that Matthew depicts an angel sitting outside on a tombstone, where all the other Gospels depict the angel being inside, angel or angels being inside. His solution? Maybe Matthew says that the angel was on the tombstone, and it's implied that he later went into the tomb before speaking to the women, and he just doesn't say it. I guess there is absolutely nothing in Matthew that suggests this. Or actually, maybe there is, because inspiring philosophy has a suggestion for why Matthew thought that's the case. So let's take a look at that.
He also says the angel stated, "Come, see the place where he lay," which implies the angels moved and one was speaking from inside the empty tomb.
So that was it, huh? Honestly, I think he would have been better just leaving this at pure speculation, because this sounds even more desperate than just, oh, I don't know, maybe it started outside and went inside and Matthew didn't tell us. Because the angel sitting out at the entrance of the tomb and saying, come in and see where he lay makes perfect logical sense, right? Like, I've been to a ton of Easter plays, and a lot of them do depict just that. It shows the angel outside the tomb saying, and sometimes singing, come see where he lay, Jesus is risen, whatever. Even in real life, how many parents have stood at the door of the house saying, hey, kids, come in. You don't need to be inside a structure to tell somebody to come into it. So, I don't know. More than if he had just purely speculated and said, maybe the angel moved and Matthew didn't tell us. This sounds like inspiring philosophy is fishing really hard for the right answer, that he's just really picking through semantics and trying to come up with something that supports his cause. Maybe there's something in the original language that supports this that I'm not aware of. I'm not seeing that, but this just sounds kind of desperate and pathetic. Now, there is a ton more to this. I've barely scratched the surface, but the problem is these contradictions with the angels and their locations start to tie into a lot of other things, so I want to wait and kind of reveal that all by itself. But keep in mind, there are a couple questions here. Does this story plausibly read as if the angel had started outside and gone inside, or is this just something you're reading between the lines because you want it to be there? And then also, are there, I don't know, maybe a lot more damning issues with these stories that inspiring philosophy hasn't even touched on? When he just deals with was the angel inside or outside the tomb, is he still kind of sitting in easy territory? He's approaching the actual problem, but there are a lot more irreconcilable things there that we haven't touched on and he's not even going to approach. So, little teaser that there's more coming.
Another objection is Luke says the angels were standing, but John and Mark say they were sitting. But the Greek word can be translated to mean appear or to be present. It does not necessarily mean to stand.
Yeah, I actually looked this up and it's true. Like inspiring philosophy said, the word translated as stood beside them does not necessarily mean that they were standing up. It just means that they approached them or were present. I see it more often being referred to as approaching or accosting or coming upon someone, not just already being there. But yeah, in the most technical sense, it doesn't mean that they were standing where another verse said that they were sitting. So that itself is not a contradiction. However, we are still residing in really easy soft pitch territory. I don't know that a lot of people point to this, and I definitely don't consider it one of the most damning contradictions.
Skeptics will also note what the angel says to the women is different in each of the synoptics. But within the ancient cultural context, exact wording was not necessary, and authors were expected to paraphrase and summarize to help readers better understand what was happening.
This is another one I feel is just pretty inconsequential. Like, do I personally think an all-powerful God presenting something as his inerrant word would give direct quotes in the same words across different tellings of the same thing? Sure, probably, but I'm not going to harp on the fact that different stories paraphrase what people said in different words, even if it's used in direct quotes, as some big contradiction. If the substance of what they said were dramatically different, that'd be a different story, but this is another kind of so what thing for me.
So given the ancient cultural context, the gospel authors were well within reason to paraphrase and summarize what the angel had said to the women. Demanding exact wording is forcing our cultural context onto the ancient world. They were more concerned with passing on meaning, as that was more important in the long run.
Now, this is incredibly interesting, and we're going to see apologists go pretty far down this "the Bible doesn't always have to get everything exactly right" rabbit hole pretty soon. Now, yeah, sure, I get it. People in ancient times wrote for different purposes in different styles than people today. So maybe we should kind of understand if first century Christians were a little loosey-goosey with the facts when passing on their stories. Fine. But I don't think this is usually what most Christians are trying to get us to believe, at least not biblical literalists. They're trying to argue that the Bible is the absolute correct, totally inerrant word of God, that every word is as true as if God spoke it himself. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of them, and I'd say most literalists to some extent. So when they present this idea, and then we bring up contradictions to argue that it's not true, we're not forcing our cultural context onto the ancient world. Biblical literalists are claiming the Bible accomplishes things far beyond the standards of typical ancient writing, and we're trying to counter that. And so I find it more than a little irritating when they turn around and act like we're just having unrealistic expectations of humans in the ancient world. They are setting the bar here, and then when we address it, they're saying, well, what are you doing? You're picking on ancient people. We're not. We're addressing the standards of absolute God-inspired literal texts that you have introduced into the conversation. So here's my message to apologists. If you want to argue that the Bible is the perfect inerrant word of God, that every word's just totally true, then fine. But stick with that, even when we bring up contradictions. Or if, on the other hand, you're one of those ones who wants to think that the Bible is often metaphorical, that it gets things wrong here and there, maybe it's a little inspired, maybe God gave some people ideas, maybe there are some core teachings in there, but it's, not literally true, then stick with that. But stick with that whether you're in a conversation with us or whether you're just speaking to your Christian audiences in general. Don't switch back and forth depending on what's most convenient. And if you want to do that, don't harp on us as if we have unrealistic expectations of people in the ancient world. That's just super obnoxious. Anyway, next I want to look at this video by somebody I'd called a rando Catholic before on my live streams at Anza. Turns out he's actually not so much. He regularly appears on Cameron Bertuzzi's live stream. So whatever that tells you about him. In this video, he's going to address a different topic, which is whether the tombstone was open or closed when the women arrived.
Matthew 28:2 and Luke 24:2. They saw the tomb. I think one verse says that the tomb was open and one verse says the tomb was closed. And I'm not sure what the deal is with that.
The caller seems to have a loose grasp of the details, but this is really a pretty straightforward one. Mark, Luke, and John all say that the women, or woman in the case of John, saw the tombstone already rolled away when they showed up. Matthew, on the other hand, shows the women arriving and then says that an angel came down and rolled the tomb away. These seem like very straightforward, irreconcilable contradictions. But let's see what he does with it.
So one of the things, and this is something we commonly discuss, the ancients did not write history the way that we do. We insist today on a very videotape-like presentation, exactly what you would have seen in exactly chronological order if you were there with a video camera.
Yeah, and there's another word for your story being the same as if you recorded it with a video camera, and that's accuracy. Keep this in mind as we move on. Keeping the chronological order of events in your story straight is not an arbitrary choice. It's an aspect of having your facts straight.
The ancients did not do that. They sometimes did that, but they weren't required to. And one of the freedoms they had was the ability to rearrange events to make the meaning clearer.
Yeah, they didn't always do that. But let's remain abundantly clear that when they didn't, a certain amount of factuality was lost. Now, this doesn't mean I have a low regard for them as people or as authors. Their writing was a product of its time. So if there was an expectation that they were to put thematic or ideological focus above the facts, or otherwise there was just a low regard for factual accuracy, that's fine. I don't put it on them. They were doing what they were expected to do, and their writing does have a certain cultural value. It does convey certain things. So respect those authors as people and intellectuals of their time. Appreciate their writing for what it was. You can do all this while still managing your expectations for factuality in their writing. You can recognize that something has since been gained when we developed methodology and expectations from our precise factuality in our accounts. So while ancient accounts aren't like stupid or worthless or anything, there are some downsides to how they told their stories, and there are definitely pitfalls to taking them as overly factual. So we need to be on guard against using this observation of ancient genres to, 1, minimize the fact that there is some objective value to factuality, including chronological accuracy, and 2, conflate questions about whether the Bible is inerrant with general disrespect for ancient authors. Now, to his last point, can rearranging events in a story make an author's meaning clear? Sure. It can draw attention to certain themes or make the connection between certain events clearer. But you can do this while still being clear about when everything happened, right? Like if I were to say I walked into my boss's office and suggested that we should cancel afternoon meetings, the day before my coworker had walked in and suggested the same thing, I'm telling those two things one after the other to make my point clear, but I gave some pretty clear prompts that showed when one happened compared to the other, right? You're not going to hear that story and think that I walked in and then my coworker did just because the other one came second. If I were to say, I walked into my boss's office and suggested we should cancel afternoon meetings, my coworker walked in and suggested that they should cancel afternoon meetings, that would sound like I was saying one came after the other, right? Or at the very least, it would be ambiguous and create confusion. So you can do things for literary focus or emphasis while still keeping your facts straight, while still making it very clear what the chronology was. Now, maybe some cultures or genres find it appropriate to rearrange events while being ambiguous about the chronology. But if they do, we should be clear about a few things. 1, it's not necessary to do this to make a thematic point. 2, doing this sacrifices accuracy if you're trying to give a non-fictional account. And 3, if the Bible rearranges chronology or makes it unclear, that does speak to the question of whether it's inerrant or how clearly inerrant it is. Now, Jimmy spends a lot of time talking about how Matthew and Mark tell the fig tree story in different orders in order to make his point, basically justifying one part of the Bible by showing how another part of the Bible has that same problem. So we're going to skip that and join back in when he gets back to his apologetic for the whole tombstone thing.
But in Mark and Luke's account, and it is clear, and this seems to be confirmed from John, that when the women showed up, the stone had already been rolled away and the tomb was empty, and then the angels talked to them. You look in Matthew's version, though, and in Matthew 28, it starts like this. Now, after the Sabbath, towards the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the sepulchre. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat upon it. And then it goes on about him and the guards, and eventually the angel talks to the women. Now, what I would say is going on here is Matthew's making it clear for his audience how the stone got rolled away.
It's pretty unmistakably true. It does nothing to resolve this contradiction, but yeah, it is true. He says it, so that made it explicit.
In Mark and Luke, and also in John, they see the stone rolled away and they meet angels, but it's not clear how did the stone get rolled away. And so what Matthew is doing is he's backing up in time a little bit to make it clear how the stone got rolled away. It was an angel that did it. It wasn't Jesus himself that did it. Jesus was already gone. An angel came down and did this, and that's how the stone got rolled away.
I guess it's fine to say that, but is there any reason to think it's actually true? The story doesn't say it happened before the women arrived. It doesn't use the past perfect tense verb to describe the angel rolling away the stone, in English or Greek as far as I can tell. It just says the Marys went to the tomb, and then there was an earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down and rolled back the stone. Everything about the sequence and how it was phrased suggests that the stone was rolled away after the women arrived. And unless I'm just really missing something, I can't see any reason to take it as meaning anything else unless you're just really dead set on reconciling this with other gospel accounts.
And if you technically, even though he mentions this, after he mentions the women going to see it, he doesn't say that the women were there to witness it. He just says they were going to see it, and this happened. But that doesn't establish a strict chronology of these events because, as we mentioned, the evangelists and other ancient historical writers outside the New Testament don't have to give us everything in strictly chronological order.
True, I guess they didn't have to. But isn't it usually safe to assume that this is what's going on unless something about how an author writes their story indicates otherwise? Usually when someone writes one thing happened and then another thing happens, you assume that it's chronological. That's how Christians generally approach the Bible, right? When they see the Bible say that Jesus was crucified, he was placed in the tomb, and then he left the tomb, they take that as sequential. They don't speculate that, I don't know, wouldn't it make more sense and give a more naturalistic reading if Jesus was somehow placed in the tomb when he was asleep, brought back out, and then crucified and he was dead and that was it? They don't do that throughout the Bible. That would just get chaotic and weird, and you couldn't establish anything about how to orient yourself within the story. So this seems like something that is just brought out when it's handy for apologetics. And this is ignoring the fact that, again, when you suggest that the Bible bends chronology for the sake of theme or focus or whatever, you're starting to fudge on the question of how, literal versus metaphorical it is.
They can do things like move slightly backwards or forwards in time or arrange things topically in order to make the significance of them clear. And what I would say is, okay, the women went there, and to make it clear to the reader how the stone got moved away, Matthew just moves backwards in time a little bit in order to show us, okay, it was an angel that did it, and then the story proceeds forward from there.
Yeah, so if Jimmy wants to claim that the Bible's just telling these stories out of order, I can't prove him wrong. But let's just be clear about the nature of the excuses we're using. By the time you're able to say that if stories tell that different people were there, they're just listing some but not others, or that even worse, stories that tell about flatly different things happening are just inserting different parts of the story from out of order, then how can anybody prove your story's wrong? And I don't mean that apologists or Christians need to go out of their way to make sure that we have a way to prove the Bible wrong, but they also shouldn't bend over backward to make sure that the Bible should never be able to prove them wrong. Basically, in the end, these kinds of excuses make the Bible unfalsifiable. There is always going to be a way to come up with some kind of explanation for why texts that say completely different things just have something between the lines that reconciles them. And you can always make up what's between the lines. And so, what are you supposed to do with that? But when it comes down to it, the fact that Christians have to resort to these measures to make sense of these stories is just about as damning as contradictions themselves. But even if they can weasel their way through enough semantics to get to these excuses, which I'd argue anybody could do for literally any story, the question remains, is this any kind of intelligent reading of the story? Well, let's take a look and see. After the Sabbath, at dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus," and then goes on to explain that Jesus was risen. Now, not only does a plain reading of this text show us the Marys going to the tomb and then the angel showing up, but then the guards are so afraid they faint, and the angel tells the women not to be afraid. This sounds an awful lot like the angel's assurance is being given in light of the fact that the women just saw what previously happened and the fear that caused the guards to faint, right? But this is the problem with determined nitpickiness. You can technically speculate that the angel did all this stuff before. You know, it sure sounds like the line saying, "Do not be afraid" immediately after a dramatic effect and other characters fainting is because of, well, all that stuff that just happened in the previous sentences. But sure, maybe there was a break in the chronology that's not hinted at anything about how the story was told, and the angel said not to be afraid for some completely unrelated reason. This is the kind of laughable thing you'll have to reach for if you're so invested in a story's consistency that you'll give yourself permission to add, subtract, or move anything that can be added, subtracted, or moved, regardless of what the story seems to be trying to say. And now, worse, let's get to more about the angels, because this is where it gets really hard, I would argue impossible, to reconcile these tales at all. Now, forget all this stuff about the number of angels, whether they were called men, whether they were sitting or standing, which women were named or not. That's all basic. In fact, I'd say these statements are carefully constructed to be easily set up and dispatched by apologists out of context with the rest of the story. But let's look at the actual sequence of events, shall we? Now, as we saw, Matthew has an angel sitting on the tombstone telling the women that Jesus had risen and that they should go tell the disciples. Now, maybe he was just sitting there before they arrived, and the story just doesn't give us any indication whatsoever that he later went into the tomb and called them in to see Jesus wasn't there. Whatever. Mark shows the women entering the tomb and finding a man, presumably an angel, inside. The man tells them roughly the same thing. He's risen, go tell the disciples. Luke shows the women entering the tomb where they had enough time to look around, see Jesus wasn't there, and wonder what happened, when two angels suddenly appeared and said a lot of other stuff, not including saying to tell the disciples, which, I guess whatever, you could argue that Luke just didn't spotlight that part. But I hope you're starting to see the actual problems with these stories and that they run a lot deeper than the number of people or angels involved. We'll get into more of that after covering John. John shows Mary, acting alone by all indications, though again maybe the story just didn't spotlight a bunch of other women with her, going to the tomb and seeing the stone rolled away. There's a whole side thing where she gets Peter and John who check things out, but let's forget that. After it says she ran to get them, it depicts Mary at the tomb crying, and she looks in from the outside and sees two angels. They ask why she's crying, and she tells them it's because the body's gone, and the angels, get this, don't tell them Jesus was risen. She learns this by turning to Jesus, who in this story was standing next to her, and she realizes it's him when he says her name. Then he says to go tell the disciples he's going to ascend to heaven. So there's a lot here, right? But let's just zero in on the angel situation. Why does Matthew have an angel telling the women that Jesus had risen while they were still outside the tomb and inviting them to go in and check, even if, as inspiring philosophy says, it had retreated inside before doing this, while Mark has the women discovering the angel and being told about the resurrection after they went into the tomb? How do you square either of these narratives with Luke's statement that angels only appeared after the women had already gone in and spent time looking around? I mean, maybe you can try to square it with Mark if you really stretch the meaning of Mark's adverbial phrase and having entered into the tomb, but it's utterly incongruous with any interpretation of Matthew. Or what about how John shows Mary peeking into the tomb without going inside and then learning about the resurrection from Jesus himself instead of an angel? That doesn't make sense with any of the other stories. Like, you simply can't reconcile it. I think that's why most of these apologists select their own easy surface-level contradictions, debunk them, and then move on. It's an easy victory that makes Christians feel like the problem's been solved so they can just walk away feeling like the Bible still makes sense, which is kind of what they wanted. So what's the benefit of digging into the nitty-gritty and really sifting through the hard contradictions? They don't want that. I don't think the audience wants it. And most of their audience is just going to go away feeling satisfied without looking any further. So where's the motivation to actually deal with this, right? There are a few apologists who actually do it, such as this one by a channel called The Bible Explained, but this takes you down a weird path of splitting the unknown quantity of unnamed women into different groups and having some of them enter the tomb, others not, some of them leaving at different times and passing each other on the way to and from the tomb and telling different disciples at different times. It's such a comically spectacular mess that I can see why most apologists dance around these stories instead of addressing them in any real way. But there's one more tactic, of course, which is simply waffling about how true the Bible's supposed to be. We've already seen our first two guys flirt with this, but let's watch William Lane Craig just really dive into this in amazingly spectacular fashion. It's pretty crazy to watch.
We've got a question here. Why are there differences in the resurrection accounts between the Gospels?
That's a good question, and I think there's a couple of theories about this that are possible. One would be that the Gospel writers use different sources.
Yeah, and all this tells us is that the Gospels contradict each other because they had sources that contradicted each other. It's really amazing how much Craig can babble to impress his audience while literally getting nowhere.
For example, Matthew used the Gospel of Mark in writing his own Gospel. Mark was one of the sources Matthew used. But that's not the only source Matthew had, because he also relates the story of the guard at the tomb, right? And that's not found in Mark. It, moreover, wasn't made up by Matthew because he's clearly reacting or responding to the Jewish allegation that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. So he's responding to Jewish anti-Christian propaganda in telling this story.
So did you catch what he seriously just said? Matthew couldn't have made up the part about the guards at the tomb because he was countering a Jewish accusation that the disciples had stolen the body. But isn't this precisely when you would make something up? Like, someone accuses you of something, you want to get your story straight. When are you more likely to lie about something? Your Honor, my client couldn't have possibly been lying when he said he was home at the time of the murder. Well, why not? Because he wouldn't have made it up, because he was clearly responding to allegations that he was at the scene of the crime. This isn't just wrong, it's so obviously ass backward it blows my mind. Like, does Craig's audience listen to him before deciding he's smart?
So here Matthew is working with a different source. Similarly, Luke has another source besides Mark, because he tells the story that was read this morning about how Peter went to the tomb to verify the women's report, and that's not found in Mark. Now, Luke didn't make that up. How do we know that? Because there's another independent source, namely John, who also tells the same story of how Peter, accompanied by the beloved disciple, went to the tomb to verify the women's report.
This is meaningless because the Gospels aren't independent sources that can be used to corroborate each other. The people who wrote them were all members of the same tight-knit cult who had every opportunity to, talk to each other and read each other's writings. Hell, Craig just said that Matthew used Mark as a source. Keep your story straight within the same minute of rambling. So how does the fact that John came along much later and repeated something that Mark said have any bearing at all on whether Mark had originally made it up? It's complete nonsense.
So if we have these multiple independent sources, then it is to be expected that they will tell the story somewhat differently.
That's fine if we're just talking about a human telling a story. But if these independent sources tell their story so differently that they contradict themselves, then they can't be collated into an inerrant perfect word of God. Let's try to keep track of the fact that that's the whole point here. Especially as Craig gets into his next point, which is where this gets really good.
But what you have in every case is the same historical core. Namely, on the first day of the week, a number of women who were followers of Jesus, including Mary Magdalene, she's always mentioned by name, went to the tomb very early and found it empty. That's the historical core. However differently these stories may be in their secondary details.
I'm pretty sure that by historical core, he just means the one part of these stories that the Gospels all agree on. And if they are different in their secondary details, then guess what? The Bible contradicts itself. And that's fine, but if you want to admit the Bible contradicts itself, don't come back and tell us that it is the inerrant word of God in another conversation.
Now, the other possible theory for these differences would be that in oral tradition, what is important is handing on the core of the story, but you can embellish or tell differently the secondary circumstantial details. And so what you would have in the Gospels would be different oral retellings of the story.
Yeah, Craig. Go around in any context other than the specific question and answer session and tell churches that the Bible is full of differences and embellishments. See how that goes for you.
And I have a wonderful illustration of this. When I was in seminary as a student, one of my professors told a joke. He said, "Did you hear about the Calvinist who fell down the elevator shaft?" And you say, "No." And he says, "Well, he got up, dusted himself off, and said, 'Phew, I'm glad that's over.'" Now, unless you know theology, you may not get the joke.
Basically, if he was a Calvinist, he thought that was predestined to happen, so he was happy to have this pre-authored part of his life over with. Ha ha. 20
years later, someone else said to me, "Did you hear about the Calvinist who fell down the stairs?" And immediately I saw what was going on. I said, "No, what happened?" And this person said, "He got up and said, 'Whew, am I glad that's over.'" Now, notice how it was told differently. He didn't fall down the elevator shaft. He fell down the stairs in the second story.
So one thing I absolutely love about this is Craig is like, 20 years later, and then goes on to tell about how different the story is because, all that time had passed. So what about the 20 years between Jesus and Paul? What about the 40 to 70 years between Jesus and the Gospels? Maybe things changed during that amount of time? It's amazing how good apologists are at debunking one point while making another one.
But the core, the punchline, "I'm glad that's over," that was identical. And that's the way oral tradition works. There is a central core that has to be gotten right in the retelling, but then the secondary details can differ. And this may be the explanation behind the differences in the gospel.
So, is Craig an atheist trying to debunk the Bible? Because that's exactly what he sounds like here, right? What would I say if asked to account for the Gospels? I would say that they were the writings of a religious community that was motivated to pass along certain core teachings and theological ideas. These ideas are the thesis of the writing, and the stories are just there to back them up. So, what's in the story is either incidental, or it can be altered in order to fit that thesis. But that one core idea is what they need to make sure survives through the story, right? That's what they need to be passed on to future generations. It's an agenda. And this is shockingly close to exactly what Craig is saying. He's comparing the Gospels to a fictional story about someone falling down an elevator shaft or some stairs in order to tell a joke. In one case, telling a joke is the agenda, and everything else can change as long as that joke remains intact. And in the other case, some core idea about Jesus and the budding Christian movement is the agenda. So is Craig saying that all the facts of the Gospels are incidental as long as that agenda remains intact, as long as the Christians get across what they're trying to say? That seems like precisely the point he's making, isn't it? But if he's willing to retreat this far when faced with obvious contradictions in Scripture, then how is the Bible anything different than what I say it is? This is a weird tack for Craig to take. And it just shows the sheer desperation of apologists when faced with contradictions in Scripture. And that's what I wanted to show in this video. It's not that the Bible has contradictions, we know that, but the weird things apologists will do to weasel their way out of them. They'll skim easy contradictions from the surface and then hope their audience will accept it and go home. They'll compromise their stance on biblical inerrancy and hope the audience accepts what they say without noticing that they, compromise their stance on biblical inerrancy. The fact that they know they have to do this shows some awareness that they're wrong. The ship's sinking and they're scrambling around trying to do enough damage control to make themselves and others feel better about it. Now, I understand the discomfort they're feeling with the nature of their own Bible, but at some point this just gets pathetic. I recognize that on my own Christian journey. I tried to reconcile all these things. I tried making these excuses. And at some point, I just realized it was just ridiculous. And also, it was a painful thing to go through to try to do that. The sooner other people can do the same, the happier they'll be, because it takes a lot of mental energy and frustration to keep, trying to tell yourself that a round peg fits through a square hole. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostedt, Dark Side of Delight Productions, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.